my former country, Lebanon, the parliament renewed their own term 3 times in a row because they don't want to hold an election. They just voted to renew their terms again and again and again. So,
thanks for bringing that up. That's given me some ideas for next year.
On this episode of Transition Virginia, our primary concern is conventional politics.
Boo.
We're joined by transition team favorites David Ramadan.
Now, the spin is one thing, the reality is another.
And Trevor Southerland.
Democrats have really just said goodbye to conventions and caucuses.
Choosing a method to select candidates on this episode of Transition Virginia.
Want to hear something amazing? Discover matches all the cash back you earn on your credit card at the end of your first year, automatically, dollar for dollar, with no limit on how much you can earn. Extra cash? Come on, how amazing is that? In fact, it's even more amazing when you realize all the places where Discover is accepted. 99% of places in the U.S. that take credit cards. So when it comes to Discover, get used to hearing yes more often. Learn more at discover.com/yes. 2020 Nielsen Report. Limitations apply.
Welcome to Transition Virginia, the podcast that examines the transition of power from Republican to Democrat in Virginia. My name is Michael Pope.
And I'm Thomas Bowman. Today on the podcast, conventional politics. That is to say, parties using conventions rather than primaries to determine statewide candidates. We're joined by transition team regulars. Our first guest is former Republican from the House of Delegates. He is now at the Schar School at George Mason University. David Ramadan, thank you for joining us.
Glad to be back.
We're also joined by the former executive director of the House Democratic Caucus and fan favorite of Transition Virginia, Trevor Southerland. Thanks for joining us.
Always glad to be here.
All right, well, let's start the discussion by laying out on the table here what we're talking about here. So when a party chooses a candidate to run for governor or lieutenant governor or attorney general or even delegate or city council member, they need to have a process for choosing the candidate. And I think most people just assume a primary is how that's normally done, but that's not always the case. In fact, the Republican Party of Virginia has had a longstanding love affair with conventions. They love using conventions to choose their candidates. David Ramadan, I've got to start with you. What's up with Republicans? Why do Republicans love conventions so much?
Well, it's not only limited to Republicans. Both Democrats and Republicans have opted in the past for a party-run nomination process known as mostly as convention. And it was the favorite for Democrats for a long period of time until in the last 10 or 15 years became the favored nomination process for Republicans. And it really comes down to the reason that Virginia does not have party registration. This whole shenanigan of party versus primary will be over if Virginia ever allows for party registration. Both parties at one time or another had said, we are worried that in an open process run by the state, people from the other side of the aisle will come and vote in our election, meaning the primary, the open primary, because anybody can walk in and vote then, and vote for the weaker candidate so that the weaker candidate will be up in the general against the other party's candidate. And we've seen some of this happen in the past. It's an arduous process. It's really not practical. Parties would pick one location in the state where everybody has to go to and be there for 2 days sometimes and run one ballot after another, and you find less than 10% of who would identify as a Republican would go to such conventions. Therefore, it becomes only the hardcore and only the extreme candidates that end up winning in general these conventions. There are always exceptions to the rule. We'll talk about that as well in the Gillespie case. But in general, it becomes a process for the hardcore and for candidates that normally cannot make it in an open party process run by the state, namely primary.
So as David Ramadan points out, it's not just Republicans. Democrats also have some history in this. And I know here at the local level, here in Alexandria, I remember covering what they called a firehouse caucus here in Alexandria when they were choosing the Democratic candidates for city council. And so they were meeting at a community center here. It was a day-long thing where if you were a registered voter, you could show up. But they made you sign a loyalty pledge promising that you would vote for the Democrat in the general election. It wasn't legally binding, but you still had to sign it. So, Trevor, is there some sort of concern among members of any political party that because we don't have party registration in Virginia, that there could be shenanigans with these sort of open forums where anybody can come and vote?
Yeah, I mean, there's always that concern when you don't have party registration that you can jump over into the other party's primary and try to do something. I think it gets even more concerning when you are doing a party run nomination process because they tend to have far less voters, whether it is a convention or a caucus or a firehouse primary or an unassembled caucus or any of these different things that we sometimes do in Virginia. You're limiting the voter pool. And when you do that, you make it easier for someone to manipulate it. It is very hard to manipulate a primary. You would have to have a mass movement of people to do that. However, if you're talking about a method of nomination where there's only going to be 300 or 400, 500 voters, that is quite easier for a different political party to try to manipulate and cause some shenanigans. So there's always that worry, especially by the party volunteers and people that are running those things.
Okay, so let's bring this up to the present day. The Republican Party just made a decision, controversial one, to have a convention rather than a primary. David Ramadan, what does that mean? What does that mean for potential Republican candidates in 2021?
Well, like everything else in 2020, these are not normal times. And this 5-hour debate that took place at the State Central Committee of the Republican Party of Virginia meeting was a typical 2020, where we saw a unique combination of members of the State Central who voted for convention, some of whom normally will not be supporters of convention. However, a candidate by the name of Amanda Chase, who's a current state senator from the Richmond suburbs area, has declared that she is running this year for governor. She is to say the least, a fiery far-right candidate who had pretty much alienated everybody in her own caucus as much as everybody that knows her, with the exception of few absolute far-right groups that she had played to. This is somebody who had gone out and said Democrats hate white people. She says the craziest things. She has been kicked out by the Republican committee in her area, sitting state senator who got kicked out by her own committee. And she no longer caucuses with the Republicans in the Senate because she knew she was going to be kicked out of that as well. I believe she has no committee assignments. So she's been alienated in the Virginia Senate. And she said that she wants to run in a primary this year, which with the number of candidates running, there was the common belief that if you have 5 or 6 or 7 candidates running and you get one extreme candidate like her who could bring in 20-30% of the vote, she could end up winning the nomination. And that scared some people to the point that they thought, oh, okay, well, let's vote for a convention where we control the process. And among that control could be the possibility of disqualifying her altogether from running in the convention because she had violated party rules and she's been kicked out of her local committee and she's technically not a Republican.
Well, wait a second. So you say she's not a Republican, but she was elected as a Republican, and it's true that she's no longer a member of the caucus, but she is an elected Republican, right?
Not anymore. She was kicked out of her own party.
Well, but she was elected as a Republican, and so right now, I mean, like...
Right now, she's an independent.
She was elected on the Republican ballot line.
Correct.
but she is not a member of the Chesterfield County Republican Committee.
To be considered a Republican, you got to be a member of a committee, since we don't have party registration in Virginia. I was a member of the Loudoun County committee when I ran for office, and I ran as a Republican, and I won as a Republican. However, a person who is no longer a member of a local committee is no longer a Republican in technicality, and therefore, if that person goes to a party-controlled process, that person could be disqualified from running in a party-controlled process.
And just to be clear, you feel like that's what will happen in the Republican convention, is if she wanted to participate and run, she would essentially be disqualified because she's not a member of her local Republican committee. Is that accurate?
Absolutely. It was not discussed at this State Central Committee meeting, which is an open meeting and everybody watching online. This is one of the dangers for her if she should run, and one of the most likely scenarios that there'll be some people that'll move to disqualify her, and the Rules Committee will likely disqualify her, yes. So the party decided to go for after a 5-hour debate back and forth, they decided to go for a convention. She immediately went out and claimed that even though she considers herself as a Republican, she's committed to running. She's going to run as an independent in the primaries, which, if you're an independent, you don't run in a primary. The senator has not gotten her facts straight. She even tried to spin it that, no, she meant the general because the general is a primary. Sorry, Senator, it's not. And so she announced that she'll be running as an independent. She meant the general. She said the primary mistakenly. However, the day after, she put out some sort of another Facebook post where she said that she's going to try to get State Central of the party to reverse that decision. And she has spoken to people, or one person who thinks he can change 5 people's minds on the committee, which, if you do simple math, would still not get her the vote because the vote went 41-28. So even if you flip 5 people and you're able to bring back the vote for another 5-hour discussion, you still are not going to be able to flip the decision.
So it's been our recent experience that conventions tend to advantage more extreme candidates, at least on the Republican side. So if Amanda Chase is to get disqualified, who could we expect to be advantaged by this decision?
Whoever is most organized at that point. And there's so many other complexities. For example, they voted for a convention. However, there was a gentlemen, gentle ladies agreement, because the rules don't allow for that, to come up with a scenario where it's an unassembled convention, something that's an unknown. Due to COVID, there's likely not going to be the capability of holding a real convention. So they're going to have to come up with a makeup convention of some sort. Could that be a drive-through convention like what we saw in the 5th District that knocked out Riggleman for good? And that was a disaster. Could it be a mail-in convention? Could it be a multi-location? They don't know. So it depends on what they end up with as far as the system, the mechanism that they're going to use. And then whoever is the most organized in that matter would be the one who could win. Now, of course, you're still going to only draw in any kind or form of a convention, you're only going to draw those that are very committed to the party. If it's some sort of a drive-through or mail-in, you may get a little more or a little bigger pool of people. However, in general, it's going to be mostly those who are committed to the party and to the party's ideology. And in that scenario, that would advantageous the person who is the most conservative or can claim to be the most conservative at the time. Those with actual records that had gone against party ideology would be in jeopardy. And it'll be up to messaging who has the best message or the most conservative message and be able to communicate it and organize based on donations and money.
Trevor Southerland, do Democrats want to run against Amanda Chase? Is she the preferred candidate to run against?
As the Republican nominee or as an independent candidate? I think the answer is probably yes, either way. Amanda Chase is from the far right. She follows the Corey Stewart mold, so to speak. She is going to, similar to Trump, she is going to excite and draw out some voters, but she is also going to lose some voters, and she is going to depress some parts of Republican turnout, especially in 2021 when you also have the House on the ballot again. Having Amanda Chase as the Republican is going to help Democrats hold that House majority because it will hurt Republican candidates in Northern Virginia, in the suburbs around Richmond and in Hampton Roads. So Amanda Chase as the Republican is better for Democrats as a whole. Amanda Chase as an independent is good for whoever the gubernatorial nominee is.
So we've talked a lot about how this convention versus a primary might influence the governor's race. In other words, having the convention helps Kirk Cox, it hurts Amanda Chase. Having the primary helps Amanda Chase more than would be for the convention. That's all at the top of the ticket. David Ramadan, what, if any, are the effects of having a convention for the lieutenant governor nominating process or the AG nominating process? How do you see those races influenced, and which candidates do you think might benefit from having a convention versus a primary?
Similar, but to a lesser degree. And by the way, a convention does not help Kirk Cox. Kirk Cox has a problem that he'll face in a convention. Kirk Cox voted for the largest tax increase in Virginia's history, which would be brought up in a convention by the base. And Kirk Cox shepherded the extension of Obamacare in Virginia, which will also be brought up to the base by a challenger in the convention. So that does not help him. It actually makes it harder for him.
Well, just to be clear, right now we've got two candidates, and if one of them is disqualified, it helps the candidate that's currently there. But I see your point, though. Like, right. So who's going to challenge Cox in a convention setting then?
It's almost guaranteed that there are going to be few more, and there are several names that are circulating. Some are closer to calling it than others. But you've got sitting members of the House and Senate that are considering it. You got people that are not serving considering it.
Who are we talking about here?
Well, former Senator Bill Carrico is thinking about it, and he has formed a small committee that is also active and working on that. Whether he does it or not, we'll see. Emmett Hanger is talking about it. Pete Snyder is most likely will end up to be a candidate. He has run before, and he'll probably run again. There's quite a bit of talk about that. There's a gentleman from the Carlisle, former co-chairman of the Carlisle group. The name escapes me. I'm told he's been holding quite a bit of meetings around the Commonwealth, having breakfasts, trying to get people's support. It's been said that he can spend $35 million out of his own money. I have not met with him, so this is third hand, but from close sources. So there'll be 3, 4, or 5 that'll end up to be there. And if they are individuals without a previous record or individuals with a conservative record, they can definitely challenge Kirk on his record and his appeal to the base using the two issues that I just brought up. As for lieutenant governor and AG, it'll be very similar. Anybody who has voted in the past from the current runners for issues that are not in line with the base are going to be challenged in a convention, and it's going to be very, very hard to convince people otherwise. In a primary, you appeal to a bigger pool of people that are not ideologically tuned as party members who would attend a convention, and several of the candidates will have to try to overcome that. Now, the spin is one thing, the reality is another. Somebody like Tim Hugo, who has a strict conservative record, will actually have an advantage in a convention. It'll play out the same thing for lieutenant governor and AG, however, to a lesser extent, because people are mostly focused on the top of the ticket.
So you think the convention might benefit like a Carrico or a Hanger for the governor's race and Tim Hugo for lieutenant governor's race. What about the AG race? Any names there you feel like the convention might help?
Miyares, I believe, is the only announced one so far, right? Is anybody else on the Republican trying to think recently
Don't forget
announced?
about Chuck.
Yeah.
Don't forget about Chuck. Come on.
I'm talking about real candidates. Sorry. Chuck is a career candidate who runs for anything and everything, and I do not believe that anyways, somebody like Miyares, who has a conservative record and up and coming and served well, made a name for himself in part of the Commonwealth that is important for general elections, would benefit from that. But it would become a challenge of ideology and record, and Chuck could make those claims against anyone. However, he has run for every open seat under the sun, and he's never won a seat. So not somebody who has a proven record of winning elections, not even on party level.
Okay, so before we go into our commercial break, it sounds like we've got the convention helping Mieres for AG, Hugo for LG, but then we got this race at the top here for governor, and I'd love to throw this open to predictions for the panel here. In a convention fight between Cox, Carrico, and Hanger, who prevails? Trevor, I'll put you on the spot first, then we'll go to David Ramadan.
Between those three, Carrico on the first ballot.
On the first ballot? Oh, wow, okay.
First ballot.
David Ramadan, what's your prediction there?
No, I agree. Carrico will win that, if that's the three. However, even though there's a lot of talk about that, I do not believe Carrico will be among the people. I mean, he's talking about it. I'm not sure that he'll do it. I think the two main competitors for it will be Kirk Cox and Snyder, and among those two, Snyder wins.
All right. Well, let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about the conventions of the past.
Save now, share now. At KCSubaru.com, we are offering 0% financing for 63 months on select new 2021 Subaru models. And during the Subaru Share the Love event, Subaru will donate $250 to your choice of charity. Go to KCSubaru.com to learn more. Submit your charity selection by 1/15/21. See Subaru.com/share for details. No down payment required. Cannot be combined with any other incentive. Financing for well-qualified applicants only. Subject to credit approval. Expires January 4th, 2021.
Hey, you. Yes, you. You're listening to Transition Virginia right now, and you're probably a fan of the podcast, right? Well, then rate and review, like Trevor Southerland.
1 star. The only time I listen is when I'm on.
That's not really what I was thinking. Well, how about this review from Richard Krause?
This piece of shit podcast, I wouldn't even rate 1 star.
Come on, listeners. I know you can do better than that. Hit the pause button right now and give us a quick review. And we're back on Transition Virginia. We're talking about conventions versus primaries. We're joined by David Ramadan and Trevor Southerland, our fan favorites here on Transition Virginia. We're going to get our time machine and talk about conventions of the past. So I have to say I'm particularly interested in the 2013 Republican Convention, which I was at in Richmond, and it was a ton of fun. I met a lot of people. It was amazing fun. I'm not really sure it was great for the party necessarily. So if you remember, if you get in the time machine and go back to 2013, this was a time when Bill Bolling was kind of the establishment favorite, and he was being challenged by Ken Cuccinelli, who was sort of the Tea Party favorite. And so initially they were going to have a primary, and then the Cuccinelli people seized control of Republican State Central Committee and changed the process so that it was a convention instead. Bolling dropped out. Cuccinelli ended up being the nominee, but it had second-order effects and third-order effects, specifically with the lieutenant governor's race, and there were a whole lot of candidates. I'm forgetting how many candidates there were. But actually, we were just talking about Pete Snyder in our previous segment. He was one of those candidates, I believe. And we ended up with E.W. Jackson. David Ramadan, talk about your memories of that 2013 convention and what that meant for the direction of the party ever since then.
Well, it started with a strategic mistake by Bill Bolling. There was no decision yet for the party or which way to go for the next nomination process. And Bill Bolling, a year in advance or a year and a half in advance, thought that he would do better in the primary, and he pushed State Central to take up the issue almost a year and a half in advance from when they normally would do, and got a vote for a primary. Brought up the issue and irked Ken Cuccinelli, who is much better at organizing, and gave Ken Cuccinelli the time to not only work the current State Central members, but actually run a campaign to run a bunch of State Central members around the Commonwealth that will end up flipping the vote. And that's what they did. He took over State Central by getting new people on there in the next election cycle for that committee. And then they brought up that vote again and flipped it to a convention, which ousted Bill Bolling out of it. So it started with a strategic mistake by Bill trying to up the vote ahead of time and trying to control the process. Anytime anybody thinks, whether you're a sitting lieutenant governor or a candidate, that you can control the future, it's going to come back and burn you, and it did. Ken took over not only as the candidate for the party at the time, but the trajectory for the party for a while. And it moved the party more to the right. And it created, even though there was no doubt at that point that Ken's going to win that nomination, there was no way anybody could figure out what the heck is going to happen for down ballot. All the concentration was on Ken's nomination, and here comes E.W. Jackson, and he beats up, trying to remember, was the third or fourth ballot is when he ended up beating the others that remained there and won the nomination.
It did go on for several ballots, and it was so interesting because if you, as someone who spends a lot of time reading about elections that happened in the 1920s and the 1910s and stuff like that, you read about, they go into the second ballot, the third ballot, the fourth ballot, sometimes down into, the 80th ballot and stuff like that. But for me, it was all stuff you read about in, history books, but seeing after the first ballot, one candidate drops out and distributes their support among the other candidates, and you got all the horse trading. And then after the second ballot, another candidate or maybe two candidates drop out, and you figure out which of the delegates go to which candidates. And so that's the process that we ended up with a dark horse candidate that no one going into that convention could have assumed this guy, E.W. Jackson, would emerge. But here's this dark horse candidate, conservative preacher, who called gays sexually twisted. He said that yoga allows for satanic possession, and he said people who didn't follow Jesus were engaged in a false religion. Trevor Southerland, talk about running against someone like E.W. Jackson as a Democrat.
I mean, running against E.W. Jackson as a Democrat, it opens up a lot of possibilities because, again, of the possibility that he cedes that middle ground with his rhetoric. But the way he got the nomination, it's one of the beautiful and horrific things of a convention. He was not supposed to win. Nobody thought he would win going into it. But he made a really electrifying speech at the convention. I think they really caught on to him and liked him there. But they didn't have time during that convention to go back and find out all of this stuff about him. They probably knew some of it, but you don't have time when it is that 1 or 2 day convention process to really be able to vet someone. And so that is part of the danger of a convention, that, you're just relying up to those delegates in the hall to choose the nominee. And sometimes they make a mistake. And I think they definitely made a mistake with E.W. Jackson.
Big mistake.
Now, as long as I've been in politics, Democrats haven't pursued a convention. I'll throw this open to the panel. When was the last time Democrats decided to hold a convention instead of a primary?
For a statewide, I don't know. I don't remember when the last time we would have had a convention for a statewide is. Sometimes it happens on the local level. However, everybody was busy paying attention to the Republican State Central Committee last week, and they might have missed the Democratic State Central Committee actually altered the party plan to make primaries now the default method of nomination for all Democratic nominations. You could change to a convention if nobody signs up by the time of the primary, but you cannot have, say, in a general delegate race now, you can't choose a convention over a primary. You have to go with the primary first. That passed with, I think it was 85%. So Democrats have really just said goodbye to conventions and caucuses, except for special elections like we're about to have in the second.
So why would the Democratic Party of Virginia choose to do that?
Well, it's simple. It's when you do a convention or when you do a party run process, there's one of two reasons you do it. Either it's because you quickly need to nominate someone, which is, for example, the way Rip Sullivan was nominated back in 2014, and it's the way whoever is going to succeed Jennifer Carroll Ford in the House of Delegates is going to be nominated. If you do a convention or a party run process, you're doing it to limit involvement. You're doing it to make sure other people who are not part of your group can't be involved in it. And oftentimes it's to give county chairs and county committee members more power. There was actually on that Democratic Central Committee meeting, there was a member of the committee that said, doing this is going to take away power from our county chairs. And everybody was okay with it because it's about putting the power back in the hands of the people, not in the hands of the county chairs and those few people who were in the party apparatus like that.
You know, one thing that occurs to me about this using a convention versus a primary is the way that David Ramadan talked about that in our first segment. It can be used as a weapon when you don't want, you know, like an Amanda Chase to be the candidate. You have a convention and that excludes her, and then you can sort of use the power of the party to prevent people from being a candidate. So is there a Democratic version of Amanda Chase who the party might want to prevent from being the nominee?
Lee Carter. One comes to mind.
But see, this is the problem, though. This is where I feel like at this point in time, the parties look at their wings differently. The Republican establishment, the normal Republicans, I'm pretty sure there's about 4 of them left, they look at their wing and they are terrified because they are insane. They are threatening people. They show up everywhere with their AKs. You look at the Democratic left wing, and I don't think Lee Carter can win the nomination. And I think most Democrats who are in the middle don't think he can either. So they don't see that as a horrible threat. The Republican Party knows that their right wing can win nominations right now. So they know that they are on the losing side of that. Whereas Democrats look at the left and think in typical elections, the candidate more towards the center normally wins the nomination.
Is that truly something that the Democrats are comfortable with after seeing the movements of AOC and Bernie Sanders? And what would stop somebody like Lee Carter from winning a nomination in a polarized atmosphere like what we saw in the past few years, even within the party?
And I think that's the difference between where the parties stand right now. On the Democratic side, if Lee Carter won the primary nomination, that would be a message from Virginia Democrats that they want to move further to the left, that they want to go in that direction, and the party would support that. The party would get behind its nominee.
Sure, but that's not basically the same as we're not worried about him, he can't win. Those are two separate messages.
You know, I'll point out Lee Carter, recent guest on Transition Virginia, where he discussed why Democrats might want to repeal right-to-work laws. He's got one of the most downloaded episodes. So as great as y'all are, Lee Carter's pretty popular.
Yeah, do not get me wrong. Lee Carter is very popular. But how many of those people, can you track how many of them were Virginians? Lee Carter has a national audience, and that helps him a lot, except for with votes. With votes, it is still just Virginians that matter. Now, he's done a good job in his delegate district because he works his district. He has done a good job there to be a good delegate for those people. Does that translate to a statewide office? I don't know. Maybe we'll find out.
And that's the danger of having different factions at different times in the party that could go out of control. And that's why some people might want to try to control the process, and brings us back to why they may keep conventions. And it's interesting and smart by the Democratic Party to choose primary as the default nomination. However, that doesn't mean that they will not use conventions again. And I would bet that, quote unquote, the old adage of the party bosses would opt for that again if they see a danger from an extreme candidate like Lee who could jump in, or if they think that that is real. Notice Trevor's initial reaction was, we don't think he can win, or Democrats don't think he can win, and that's why they're not worried about it. But if they do think he can win, you will see that move go back. In history, and I don't recall either when was the last time on the state level the Democratic Party held a convention, but they used to for a long period of time during the Byrd eras and other eras, where when you want to control, when you have somebody who has the capability of controlling or wants to control a certain movement within a party, you'll see that party going towards a convention.
So the conventional wisdom, get it? Conventional.
Yeah.
Conventional wisdom is that when Republicans have conventions, they end up with the Ken Cuccinelli candidate or the E.W. Jackson candidate. However, there is some counter examples there, which are interesting to think about, because when the Republicans had a convention to pick their U.S. Senate candidate, they picked Ed Gillespie, the establishment choice. And when Republicans had a statewide primary to choose their U.S. Senate candidate a few years later, they picked Corey Stewart, who is the more extreme candidate. So sometimes this logic is upside down, isn't it?
Correct. And it's the exception of the rule. The rule is you end up with the more extreme candidates in conventions and the more mainstream candidate in primaries. However, those two are the exceptions of the rule, and they're different years with different dynamics. I earlier mentioned that who will end up winning the convention is going to be the person who is the most organized with a good message to claim the bona fides that he or she needs in that party. And Ed Gillespie is incredibly smart, incredibly shrewd, had a great organization at the time, had the resources, and actually thought and figured out consciously that the convention would be better for him to get the nomination, and worked it hard, was able to cash in all the relationships that he has around the state. That's a former chair of the Republican Party of Virginia, former chair of the National Party in the GOP, the RNC, former advisor to the president, a huge money fundraiser. So he was able to use his experience, his relationships, his favors, his IOUs, and had an excellent organization with the resources needed to win the convention. Now, remember, he was never elected prior to that. The only elected positions he was in were party elections, where he had done the party work and was, quote unquote, the party ideologue as a party chairman. So all of his previous record work with who tend to attend the convention, the base of the party that care about the certain ideology. So you couldn't challenge him on issues like, for example, what they will challenge Kirk Cox in this convention on. And he was able to claim the bona fides that he needed to win the convention, because the only record that he has are party records, which work within a convention. That doesn't work on the other side for somebody who has been in office and had voted against the party base ideology. It also worked as an exception for Corey Stewart, by the way, because Corey was being accused of raising taxes in Prince William. And the primary worked for him because he was at a danger if he had gone for a convention because of his tax votes in Prince William. And that's why even though he is the far-right candidate at the time, he had a record that would have hurt him in a convention, and that's why he was able to work it out within the primary.
And the key word there through all of that was organization.
Correct.
No matter whether you're in a convention or a primary, the way you win a campaign is by your organizing effort. When you were in a convention, if you were good at knowing how to organize, how to win a convention, you can do that. We saw it just last year where I live, where Chris Peace was ousted from his delegate seat. Had that been a primary, Chris Peace would have easily won the Republican nomination, but it wasn't. It was a convention, and the other side managed to out-organize Peace at the county unit level and managed to take over the Hanover County Committee, managed to get more delegates to the convention, and that's how they won. So it's all about your organization, and when you're in a convention, it is a totally different race than a primary.
Sure. And organization, not just pre-convention, but during the convention. In a statewide convention that's going to take place for 24 or 48 hours in one location, you're going to have to be organized enough to be able to react, get the message to the people that are there, keep them there, and so that you keep your votes on the second, third, fourth, whatever number of ballots. Otherwise, your voters would just walk away after a few hours and go for lunch or dinner or go home. unless you've bussed them in. I mean, the whole convention apparatus is so different than any other election that involves even bussing people in and out, arranging for sleeping accommodations, having enough people on the convention floor, having walkie-talkies, having messaging, having floor leaders, it's a whole different organizational method that requires and have specialists that know what to do with it. That is not the normal election.
You know, there is a layer of nuance here, I think, that's a little deeper than organization that you all bring up. And conventions favor, in a way, demagogues with a cult following willing to stay to the bitter end. Look at Bob Good versus Denver Riggleman. As you get on to later and later ballots, you know, people have families, people have lives, people can't stay indefinitely, even if they are diehard for whatever party they're part of. So this is my hypothesis. The longer the convention goes on, the more it favors the celebrity with a cult following.
Partly. It will only if there is a lack of organization by the other candidates. If the other candidates are organized enough, that will not affect. However, a demagogue could use the lack of organization by the other candidates, and even if he doesn't have one, then the demagoguery would be the messaging versus organization on the other side. So if all is equal, nobody have a good organization, then yes, demagoguery will work. However, demagoguery will not work if a good candidate has good organization, good plan, and is able to act on that plan depending on what changes on the floor as the convention goes along.
Okay, well, we've got to take a break because I'm ready for question time.
We know you have a lot of choices when it comes to your education. It's time to make Thomas Nelson your first choice. We believe learning should be personalized to fit your needs. 50 years ago, we opened our doors to provide Peninsula residents access to a high-quality education. Today, Thomas Nelson continues that tradition and offers an education that is personal, affordable, flexible, and local. Make Thomas Nelson your first choice. Success. It's closer than you think. Visit us at tncc.edu.
If you want to benefit from Pay to Play, now you can by joining Transition Virginia's exclusive Patreon community. Chip in as little as $3 to help us produce this podcast. Sustaining members get their questions asked on the show, which means you know the next guest before the episode comes out. So if you want us to ask your questions, or even if you just want to support the show, hop over to transitionvirginia.com and click the orange button to become a Patreon patron today. And now it's time for our favorite segment. It's time for Question Time. This is the segment where we take questions from our listeners, especially Patreons. And by the way, we owe some new Patreons shout-outs. Thank you to recent patrons Pete Gibson, Virginia's favorite union printer, Harrison Roday, and Jamie Lockhart. Transition Virginia greatly appreciates your support for the show.
Our first question comes from friend of the show and former guest Matt Colt Hall. He wants to know why Republicans keep playing games with nomination contests. And David Ramadan, I'll direct that question to you with a little bit of a piggyback, which is it does strike a lot of people as a little bit strange that this decision was made specifically to exclude a particular candidate. In other words, you've designed your whole nomination process to make sure Amanda Chase is not the nominee, right? That strikes a lot of people as playing games. How do you react to that?
It wasn't the whole process. It was part of the process or part of the coalition that came together between the state central members who are believers in convention and those who figured convention is convenient for them this time. But this is not just why Republicans play games. This is human nature, unfortunately. When individuals think they can play the system, that's why we see crime. That's why we see people that speed. That's why we see conventions by Democrats and by Republicans. Now, more so recently on the Republican side. But it's human nature to try to control an outcome. And human nature is to try to defy the common or equality among all. In this here, we're talking about equality of vote or equality of process, not equality of individuals. And because of that human nature, you end up getting people that think because of power they can play games. And our history is full of it in the United States, outside the United States. Thankfully, this is still the greatest country on earth where our games are on an election process versus our games are on throwing people in jail, as in third world countries, or coups, or stopping an election. Or my former country, Lebanon, the parliament renewed their own term 3 times in a row because they don't want to hold an election. They just voted to renew their terms again and again and again. So we don't have those shenanigans. So as much as I don't like to see the shenanigans that we have, we are still in a great place in our world order.
Thanks for bringing that up. That's giving me some ideas for next year. So.
Eileen wouldn't let you, buddy.
Okay. We've got another question here from friend of the podcast, Sarah Taylor. She asks, what are the public health optics of a primary versus a convention during a pandemic? Grip and grin, retail politics, shaking hands and kissing babies across the state to get your name recognition up for a statewide run seems irresponsible or at least unwise.
Yeah, and that's where you actually saw some of that play out in that Republican State Central Committee meeting and the gentleman's agreement that David mentioned earlier in the show, which we also found out is not in Roberts or Jefferson's rules. But you saw that play out where they were talking about, how is the convention? Is it assembled? Is it unassembled? There was some confusion. And finally, Rich Anderson said, well, if you say convention, that leaves it up to us to determine it later. And then there was an attempt to get it. It's all that. The bigger question, though, is do people going to a Republican convention believe COVID is a problem? If they don't believe it's a problem, then, it only looks bad to others. So that's the main issue, is that you have to actually respect the virus enough to know that it's an issue.
Hard to win when your whole party message is going to get people killed.
And that's the challenge that the Republican Party will have this year. Now, how much of this atmosphere will exist in May or June of 2021, 6 months, 5 months after Trump has, gone on his plane to Florida? That's to be determined. Had this been a convention today, the optics would be pretty bad. We saw a county in Virginia in the past couple of days that got cited by the board, got cited by the health department, and they claimed that, having 100 people in the county boardroom to support a resolution against masks is part of doing government business, and it's exempted under the governor's order. So those are not good optics, and those are shenanigans that are not good for their own constituents or for themselves. Will these be the optics in several months into 2021? That remains to be unknown. And I hope for the sake of the country that there will not be the case.
Our next question comes from friend of the show, Brad Kuttner, who's a reporter with Courthouse News. He's wondering if Republicans are worried about Democrats using this as a line of attack. In other words, Virginia Republicans didn't even elect their candidate. Their party had a backroom meeting without any kind of input from the public. Trevor Southerland, I'll direct that question at you. Is this decision to go with a convention rather than a primary going to be used by Democrats as a weapon to say you're not democratic and you're not open to input from the public and you're the party of backroom deals?
I mean, it could be, but most general voters don't care about that. They're not going to look too far to figure that out. The people who will care about that, however, are the Trump supporters, the Amanda Chase supporters, who, if they see her, possibly not get on the ballot as an independent, or even, using that just to say, hey, look, the Republican Party is corrupt. They're using these backroom methods, these backroom deals. They're acting like it's still the 1860s, holding these conventions. The Democratic Party, we're a big tent. We're open. We're willing to talk. The Republican Party, it's just all about establishment rule. Sure, that'll work with some of those folks. With middle of the line voters, though, I don't think it really plays that much, because they're more worried about the vaccine, they're worried about education, they're worried about the roads and their jobs.
David Ramadan, are you worried about this decision on the convention being weaponized against the party?
I think it is worrisome for Republicans to have a nominee elected by a convention, not for the reasons that your caller had questioned, not because Democrats could attack him on it for backroom deals, but because of what could happen in a convention, because of the mechanicals of holding a convention, and because any party, Republican or Democrat, who would choose their nominee that way would have given up the opportunity during the primary season to reach out to more voters, to build their lists, to be able to put a message out, and they'll be running behind in messaging and reach to the general populace that are going to vote in November. They'll be running behind the opposing party. Here, it'll be running behind the Democrat nominee.
Hey, one quick announcement before we go. Transition Virginia has been invited by the moderators of r/Virginia on Reddit to do an AMA, an Ask Us Anything thread on Reddit. It's not scheduled yet, but keep a lookout for that in the near future.
So that's it for this episode of Transition Virginia. But if you have any comments or questions about what you've just heard, or maybe you want to drop us a line to tell us how much you really love our podcast, please write us an email at transitionvapodcast@gmail.com. We might even read it on the air. Subscribe to Transition Virginia anywhere pods are cast. Follow the Transition team on Twitter. You can find us also on Facebook or the website, transitionvirginia.com. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you can enjoy the next episode of Transition Virginia.
If you're a defender fighting to protect your organization from cyber attackers, you must be successful ending attacks every single time. They only need to be successful once. Cyber Reason reverses the attacker's advantage. Our future-ready attack platform gives defenders the wisdom to uncover, understand, and piece together multiple threats, and the precision focus to end cyber attacks instantly. Together, we are the defenders. Cyber Reason. End cyber attacks. From endpoints to everywhere. Learn more at cyberreason.com. That's CYBEREASON.com.
We know you have a lot of choices when it comes to your education. It's time to make Thomas Nelson your first choice. We believe learning should be personalized to fit your needs. 50 years ago, we opened our doors to provide Peninsula residents access to a high-quality education. Today, Thomas Nelson continues that tradition and offers an education that is personal, affordable, flexible, and local. Make Thomas Nelson your first choice. Success. It's closer than you think. Visit us at tncc.edu.